At 6:15 on the morning of the 11th of December, 1941, gunner's mate second class Henry Elrod stood at the breech of his 5-inch coastal defense gun, watching the horizon through the gray tropical murk. Behind him, his crew moved in the strange quiet that comes before violence. Powdermen checking their stations, loaders arranging shells with the methodical care of men who've rehearsed this exact sequence 300 times. Elrod was 28 years old from South Carolina, and he'd been in the Marines long enough to know that the next few hours would determine whether he lived to see the end of the week. Somewhere beyond the reef, Japanese destroyers were coming. The gun at his station, Battery A, positioned on the northern shore of Wake Island, was one of just 4 5-inch guns that stood between the American garrison and complete annihilation. No aircraft, no battleships, no reinforcements within 1,200 miles. Just 4 guns, 43 Marines, and 1,600 shells that would have to count. The sun broke through the palm trees, painting long shadows across the sand. Elrod's men were ready. What they didn't know, what nobody on Wake Island could have known, was that by the time that sun reached its zenith, they would have accomplished something that seemed statistically impossible. They would sink a Japanese destroyer, the Kisaragi, a 1,600-ton vessel with a crew of 148 men and firepower that outmatched their position by every rational calculation. The American gun crews wouldn't do this with luck or with a single miraculous shot. They would do it with training, discipline, and a clarity of purpose that came from understanding they had nowhere else to go. The war in the Pacific had begun, from the American perspective, exactly 3 days earlier. The attack on Pearl Harbor on 7th December had awakened the American military apparatus to a threat that had seemed remote even to the men stationed at the far eastern perimeter. Wake Island, a coral atoll just over 2,000 miles west of Hawaii, was one of those places that appeared on strategic maps but seemed largely irrelevant to the real war that everyone assumed would happen elsewhere. It was a refueling stop for Pan American Airways flying boats, a minor American outpost in a vast ocean. The island measured roughly 4.5 miles in length and never exceeded 1,200 yards in width at its broadest point. Its highest natural elevation was barely 21 feet. On a clear day, you could walk the perimeter in an afternoon. Yet Wake Island had suddenly become consequential. The Japanese were moving south with systematic precision, and any American position they encountered on that path would either be reinforced or abandoned. The decision came down to a single question that was being asked in Washington and Hawaii simultaneously. Was Wake Island worth saving? The answer ultimately was no, but the men there wouldn't learn that until after they'd already decided to fight. The Marine garrison numbered just 1,616 men in total, mostly construction workers, machinists, and laborers from the contractors' Pacific Naval Air Bases who had been pressed into emergency military service. They were led by Major James Devereux, a career officer with a background in artillery, who understood that his most valuable asset was time. If he could delay the Japanese, even for a matter of days, reinforcements might arrive from Hawaii. The Navy had rushed out a small task force built around the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, but it was still 3 days away, moving westward at best speed. Every hour that Devereux's men could hold the island increased the possibility of relief. The 5-inch guns were the island's primary defense. There were 4 of them in total, 2 at Battery A on the north shore where Elrod stood, and 2 at Battery L on the opposite side of the island. They were old guns dating to the 1920s, salvaged from mothballed warships and hastily installed. Each gun could fire approximately 15 rounds per minute, though accuracy diminished severely after sustained rapid fire as the barrels heated. The gun crews had practiced their gunnery constantly since arriving on the island months earlier, but they'd done it with the knowledge that war was something that happened to other people in other places. That assumption had died along with more than 1,100 men at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack on Wake Island had commenced at 8 a.m. on December 8th, just 12 hours after the Pearl Harbor strike. It came from the air, twin-engine Japanese bombers sweeping in from the west, striking the island with a methodical precision that suggested they had all the time in the world. The attack lasted 90 minutes and cost the defenders one precious asset, their four obsolete Wildcat fighters. All four American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Japanese lost just one bomber. After that first air raid, Wake Island's defense rested entirely on the men who crewed the anti-aircraft guns, the handful of rifles, and those two pairs of 5-inch guns positioned on either shore. For 3 days, the Japanese had probed the island with sporadic air attacks. The garrison had dug in, moved ammunition stores, and prepared their positions as thoroughly as time allowed. Men worked in 12-hour shifts, sandbagging gun positions, digging rifle pits, creating fields of fire that maximized the usefulness of their limited firepower. The condition of the men was increasingly precarious. There was fresh water, the island had rainwater collection systems, but the food situation was becoming critical. The Japanese air raids had destroyed much of the food storage, and the stores that remained would last perhaps another 10 days at full rations, less if the siege continued. By the morning of December 11th, Elrod and his gun crew at Battery A had received word that Japanese ships were approaching. The report came through the makeshift communication system that linked the various defensive positions across the island, a destroyer, possibly two. They were coming through the lagoon from the northwest, moving slowly, probably protected by air support that would arrive shortly. Elrod's job was simple: put rounds downrange with maximum accuracy and maximum rate of fire. The timing would have to be precise. Once the Japanese discovered the location of the gun, they would return fire with weapons that could destroy the position entirely. At 6:47 a.m., the Japanese destroyer Kisaragi appeared through the morning haze, moving deliberately towards the north shore of Wake Island. The Kisaragi was 324 feet long, displacing 1,600 tons, equipped with four 4.7-inch guns and 6 smaller weapons. She was crewed by 148 men under the command of Lieutenant Commander Kaiichi Tamura. The destroyer was moving towards a shallow-water approach designed to bombard the island's defensive positions. Her captain presumably assumed that the American defenders had nothing that could threaten a vessel of her class. 4 5-inch guns crewed by men who'd had only days to prepare could hardly present a serious problem to a modern destroyer escorted by air support. Elrod gave the order to open fire at 6:52 a.m. The first round from Battery A screamed away from the northern shore, a 50-pound projectile moving at 2,600 feet per second. It missed. The second round, fired 40 seconds later, was better adjusted. Somewhere in the darkness of the gun's mechanical calculation of distance and trajectory, Elrol's men had seized an advantage that the Japanese had completely failed to anticipate. They were firing from a prepared position against a target they'd been studying for 3 days. The Kisaragi's crew, by contrast, was attempting to operate in unfamiliar waters against an adversary they'd assumed to be negligible. The Japanese destroyer returned fire, her guns flashing in the pre-dawn light. Rounds struck the beach near Battery A, sending up sprays of coral sand. American crews worked the guns with mechanical precision: load, aim, fire. The rate of fire was calculated to manage the heating of the barrel, to maintain accuracy, to maximize the statistical probability that at least some of the shells leaving Wake Island would find their target. Battery L, 2 miles away on the southern shore, couldn't engage the destroyer directly, but the crews there worked on anti-aircraft positions, preparing for the fighter escort that would surely arrive within minutes. By 7:15 a.m., the Kisaragi had taken hits. The destroyer, moving at reduced speed in shallow water, made an increasingly attractive target. A round from Battery A struck the vessel's hull. Another round passed through the superstructure. Japanese personnel could be seen gathering on the deck, attempting to return fire accurately whilst managing the increasing damage. The destroyer's rate of fire began to slow, not from mechanical failure but from the increasing chaos aboard, as shell damage cascaded through the vessel's interior systems. At 7:22 a.m., a 50-pound projectile from Battery A struck the destroyer's magazine. The explosion that followed was visible from every defensive position on Wake Island. The Kisaragi's hull split open. Her stern rose into the air at an angle that no ship's structure could sustain. Men, 148 of them, were pitched into the shallow lagoon water. The destroyer sank rapidly, settling into the soft bottom of the reef-protected waters in less than 8 minutes. The entire engagement, from first shot to final sinking, had lasted just 30 minutes. Elrod's gun crew stood amid the cordite smoke and spent shell casings, looking out at the wreckage of what had moments before been a modern warship. They'd done what they'd been trained to do, they'd done it correctly, and they'd accomplished something that the Japanese War Department in Tokyo had apparently believed impossible. They'd killed a destroyer with coastal defense guns.
The victory, though, was inevitably incomplete. By 8 a.m, Japanese aircraft began appearing overhead, their engines roaring across the narrow sky above Wake Island. The gun crews switched targets, directing their fire at the fighters and bombers that came in waves throughout the morning. But now the psychological calculation had shifted. The destruction of the Kisaragi meant that the Japanese would take Wake Island more seriously. They would commit more resources. They would not assume that the American defenders could be intimidated into surrender. Throughout the remainder of the 11th of December, the struggle continued. Anti-aircraft crews worked their guns until exhaustion made simple coordination difficult. The Japanese aircraft attacked with increasing aggression now, dive-bombing the positions that had proved so troublesome. Battery A took direct hits late in the afternoon, damaging one of the 2 guns. A bomb fell close to Battery L, wounding several crew members. By nightfall, the full complement of 5-inch guns that had begun the day had been reduced to 2 functional weapons. The strategic situation was unchanged. Wake Island remained an isolated American position surrounded by Japanese forces that now possessed absolute air and naval superiority. The task force built around the USS Lexington, rushing westward from Hawaii, began to receive messages from the island describing the deteriorating situation. The carrier's commander calculated distances and fuel consumption. He calculated the odds of successfully defending Wake Island against the assembled Japanese forces. He calculated the risk of losing the Lexington in an attempt to relieve a garrison that was already being systematically destroyed. Those calculations led to a series of orders that redirected the carrier away from Wake Island, back towards the safety of Pearl Harbor. No reinforcements would arrive. The men at Wake Island didn't receive this information immediately. For several more days, they continued to defend their position, continue to work the guns, continue to fight with the assumption that relief was still possible. The reality was that the sinking of the Kisaragi had been their greatest achievement and their final meaningful success. Every engagement after that morning of the 11th of December represented a slow erosion of capability against an enemy that could afford to lose resources far more easily than the defenders could. Devereux received the order to destroy the remaining guns and equipment and to prepare for surrender on December 22nd. The garrison destroyed the last functional 5-inch gun themselves, denying it to the enemy. They spiked the barrels and rendered the firing mechanisms inoperable. The men who'd crewed those guns, Elrod amongst them, stacked their arms and waited for the Japanese occupation forces to arrive. Elrod survived his captivity and returned to South Carolina at the end of the war. He died in 1967, only 36 years old. He never became famous. The sinking of the Kisaragi never appeared in major newspaper headlines with the prominence it might have merited. it was overshadowed by larger events and grander strategic considerations. But on the 11th of December 1941, in the pre-dawn hours of a morning that would extend across an entire war, a handful of men working coastal defence guns had proved that training, discipline and tactical advantage could overcome material inferiority. They'd sunk a destroyer. They'd done it in a single morning. And for just a few hours, they'd made Wake Island into a place where the Japanese didn't possess complete and unquestioned superiority. The island fell ultimately because superiority in numbers, firepower, and resources proved insurmountable. But the men who'd stood at the guns in the early morning light had stood there knowing they were outmatched, and they'd fought anyway. That's the part of the story that survives the strategic calculations and the historical narratives. That's the part that made the 11th of December 1941 something worth remembering.